So my name is Robert Merget, and I'm also from Ruhr University Bochum, and I'm presenting our joint work on scalable scanning and automatic classification of TLS padding oracle vulnerabilities. So first off, let me introduce you shortly to TLS. So if you don't know, TLS is the cryptographic protocol, which is also used in HTTPS, so you'll find it in the browser here. And it's a very nice target for attackers because they might want to steal some cookies or some other sensitive information. And this is actually what we are going to do in this talk. So we want to steal some cookies. So let me introduce TLS first. So TLS is a protocol which contains basically of two layers. So first there is this handshake phase where the cryptographic algorithms and keys are negotiated, while afterwards there is this application data phase where the negotiated keys are actually used to encrypt application data. And for this is actually where we want to attack the protocol. So we actually want to attack the application layer of this protocol. So in TLS there's this concept called Cipher Suites. So a cipher suite is a set of cryptographic algorithms which you can negotiate for a session. So in this example, we have RSA as the key exchange algorithm, AES as the block cipher, and the block cipher is used in the modes CBC, and as a pseudo-random function, and in the HMAC we use SHA-1. So in this talk, we only attack cipher suites which use the CBC mode as a mode of operation. So if a cipher suite is negotiated which does not use the CBC mode, you are not vulnerable to this attack presented here. So how does the CBC mode actually look like in TLS? So in TLS, there is this concept of MAC, then pad, then encrypt. This means that if you want to send some encrypted data, you first compute an HMAC with that data, and then you pad this data. So you add additional nonsensical bytes to the end of the message so that your plain text message is a multiple of the block size of a block cipher. So for example, if you have 1 byte of padding, you add just 0 byte. If you have 2 bytes of padding, you add 2 1 bytes. And if you have 3 bytes, you add 2 bytes, and so on. And afterwards, you just simply encrypt the whole plain text with a CBC mode and generate some ciphertext, which you then can send to the other side. So how does the CBC mode actually look like? So in the CBC mode, if you want to, here's the decryption depicted. So if you want to decrypt some data, you first decrypt it with a block cipher, and then you compute the exclusive OR with some initialization vector to generate the message you want to actually decrypt. And if you want to decrypt more than one ciphertext block, you simply decrypt the next ciphertext block and compute the exclusive OR with the previous ciphertext block. And you continue until there are no more ciphertext blocks left. And the last message will eventually contain some padding. So the CBC mode has an interesting property, meaning that it's malleable. This means that an attacker can actually flip a bit in the ciphertext, and he will know that he will also flip the according bit in the plain text of the next message block. So why is this dangerous, or why is this a problem? Because what an attacker can also do, he can cut off a part of a ciphertext like this, and then suddenly the receiver of such a message will interpret the plain text as some padding. And this can be exploited by an attacker in a so-called padding oracle attack. So if a server acts as an oracle and reveals to us the information if a padding is either valid or invalid, we can use that to deduce information about the plain text. In this example, we send some malformed message to the server, and he responds with an invalid padding. But if we send some other malformed message to the server, he may respond with a valid padding. And if he does this, we suddenly learn something about the plain text. Namely, we learn that this blue part, XOR the plain text message, equals some valid padding. And you can imagine that if we continue sending malformed messages to the server, we can finally decrypt the whole message. And this is obviously bad, because an attacker should not be able in possession of M2 if he does not have a key. So if you paid close attention, you might have wondered why this attack is possible in TLS, because there's an HMAC, right? But the problem here is that TLS uses this MAC, then pad, then encrypt scheme, so that a receiver of a ciphertext cannot check the HMAC up front. So what he first has to do, he has to decrypt the message, and then he has to check the padding to find the position of the actual HMAC. So he cannot check the HMAC before he checked the padding. So how does this actually look like in TLS in practice? So an insecure server will respond to some messages with an invalid HMAC alert, and to other messages it will respond with an invalid padding. So there are two different behaviors which we can actually observe in a vulnerable server. A secure server will always respond the same way, and it's not differentiable by an attacker if the padding was valid or invalid. So TLS padding oracles are nothing new. So there has been quite a lot of research on TLS, and especially on the CBC mode. And the first padding oracle vulnerabilities were introduced by Serge Volonnet in 2002, and they were not so practical yet, but they showed the general concept of attack. So afterwards, some of you might recognize the Poodle attacks. They are quite famous because they broke SSLv3, and they taught us as a community that we need to check each byte of a padding. So we cannot have some arbitrary non-determinism in the padding, and we need to check each and every byte of them. So there's not only Poodle attacks on SSLv3, but there are also implementation vulnerabilities in newer TS versions, which can also be affected by Poodle. Then there's this interesting CVE from 2016, and it taught us about interesting malformed messages. So not all messages need to contain all parts of the message, which was quite new for the time. And finally, there's the Lucky 13 attack, which is a timing-based side channel attack, which is actually in the specification. So if you are not very carefully when implementing this, you will automatically implement the side channel attack, so you're vulnerable to this attack, which made the whole padding oracle discussion way more complex. In this paper, we also did not consider any Lucky 13 side channels or any timing side channels, because this is not measurable for the internet. And finally, there's the robot attack. It was presented last year at USENIX here, and it's not a classic CBC padding oracle attack, but I still have it here on the slides because it's actually introduced us to something quite interesting, namely TCP side channels. So there are not only different error messages, but there are also different states of a socket we can observe as an attacker. So let's speak about padding oracles in the wild. So we know that padding oracles are known since 2002, and what we asked ourselves, how common are they today in 2018, 2019? Are they still a thing, or are they already gone because everybody knows about them? So what we thought is, let's scan the Alexa top 1 million. That's a list of the websites which are most prominent on the internet, and find out how many vulnerable servers there actually are. But when the question arose, well, how do we actually do this? So there are quite a few ways to create those malformed messages and to scan different things. So what's the best way to find the most vulnerabilities? So first off, we asked ourselves, how should our malformed messages look like? So does it matter which part of a padding we malform, which bit, which byte? Is this important if we modify the HMAC, and so on? So we are not sure how to tackle this problem. When we ask ourselves, does it matter if we scan different TLS versions, or is it enough if we just scan one version and then conclude from that information about other versions? Or is it important if we scan different block ciphers? So if a server is vulnerable on triple DES, is he also vulnerable on AES or the other way around? So maybe we can take some shortcuts here if we want to scan the Alexa list. Or does it matter which key exchange algorithm we use? So intuitively, it should not make any difference if you use RSA or elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman or Diffie-Hellman for the key exchange. You would expect that you still receive the same padding oracles. But we had some indications from the robot paper that this might be also not the case. So let me introduce you to our message design. So what we did is we had a brainstorming session, and we thought about all the previous padding oracle vulnerabilities in the wild, and came up with a list of different things we might want to test for. So in this example, we have some data, we have some HMAC, and we have some padding, and we flipped the last bit of a padding to 1. So a server which receives this message would obviously reject it. And analogously, we created different variations of this message with the bit flips at different positions. So one time we bit flipped in the middle, one time we bit flipped in the end. And then we did the same for the HMAC. So we flipped different bits in the HMAC, so we might trigger servers which did not check the HMAC completely, or so on. And we also created combinations of both. So there are bit flips in the HMAC and in the padding. And finally, we came up with special vectors. So they are not intuitively. So these vectors contain no HMAC, but they contain no data, but they contain an HMAC and a lot of padding. So in TS, you can actually specify more padding than you actually require to hide the length of a message. And we used this feature to generate very long padding and to maybe trick the servers into revealing different behaviors if they find out that suddenly there's no application data. So again, we created different versions of this padding, of these vectors with bit flips at different positions. And we also came up with these vectors. So they look very similarly, but the padding is actually 1 byte longer and the HMAC is 1 byte too short. So a server which would want to validate the HMAC might run into an off-by-1 error. So we first removed the first byte of the HMAC, and in the second vector, we removed the last byte of the HMAC. And finally, we came up with special messages I talked about beforehand. So these messages do not contain an HMAC at all. They contain only padding. But you can't tell that if you did not decrypt the message. So the first one contains only valid padding. The padding is actually valid, but when there's no HMAC. And the second vector contains actually also only padding, but the padding is also invalid. So the server cannot check the whole padding in the message. So in total, we came up with 25 malformed messages, which we wanted to try to send to servers to trigger these padding oracle vulnerabilities. So what we had a problem. So the problem was if we will send 25 messages on all the CBC Cipher Suites the server supports, and then on multiple versions, we end up with a lot of handshakes. So in this example, 500. And if we assume that we want to scan 1 million servers, we end up with 500 million handshakes, which will probably take a long time. So you get a blurry image of a scan. So what we then came up is this pre-scanning technique. So what we did is we tested 50,000 random servers on the internet which responded on port 443 and tested what is actually necessary to scan. So is it necessary to scan TS 1.0 and TS 1.1, 1.2, or is it enough if we scan just one of them? We tested with all available Cipher suites, and we tested with all 25 malformed messages. So the pre-scanning results were, is it actually necessary to scan with different versions? Yes, it is. Some servers are only vulnerable on TS 1.0 or only vulnerable on TS 1.2, while they still support the same Cipher suite on the other version. Also, is it important if we scan different block ciphers? Yes, it is. Some servers are only vulnerable on AES while they're not vulnerable on TripleDES, or the other way around, while they still support the according other Cipher suite. And finally, is it important if we scan different key exchange algorithms? So does it matter if we scan only RSA, or do we need to scan both, or all of them? So yes, unfortunately, yes. So some servers are only vulnerable on RSA Cipher suites, but not on elliptic curve Cipher suites. So we assume that this is because there's some multi-implementation setup where, depending on the selected Cipher suite, a different implementation processes the encrypted messages. And finally, we asked ourselves which of the malformed messages are actually necessary to find all the vulnerabilities in those 50,000 servers. And those are the 4 messages we actually require to find all those vulnerabilities. So if you only send these 4, you would get the same results in the 50,000 servers. So we used only those messages in the final study. So this is what we did. We tested the Alexa top 1 million with these 4 messages, all the CBC Cipher suites the server supported, all the protocol versions the server supported, and came up with the following results. So it took us roughly 72 hours to scan the Alexa list, and roughly 78% of the servers responded on port 443, so they were probably wanting to speak TLS with us. And from those servers, we found that 18,257 are actually vulnerable to padding oracle vulnerabilities, so it's roughly 1.83%. This is quite a lot in my eyes. But we still ask ourselves how many different vulnerable implementations are responsible for this. So it might be that there's just one vulnerable implementation, which is quite common, or are there multiple implementations? So we also wanted to know this because we wanted to responsibly disclose our results. So what we did is we fingerprinted every vulnerable server with all the malformed messages, and to create some sort of fingerprint which we can use to compare the vulnerabilities. So how do those fingerprints look like? So in this example, you can see the vector we sent to the server, and on the other side you can see the response from the server. In this case, it responded with a bad record MAC alert and a TCP fin. So we closed the TCP socket with a TCP fin. And if you do this for all the messages, you get something like this. So you can see all the messages and all the answers from the server. And as you can see, there's some difference. So if a server responds differently to some of those messages, he is vulnerable to a padding oracle attack. And in this case, you can see that the messages which contain only padding, either valid or invalid, trigger a record overflow in the server, while all the other messages trigger a bad record MAC. So in total, we found 93 different behaviors from servers. So assuming that you cannot configure your server to respond with different behaviors, this means that there are likely 93 different vulnerable implementations out there. So we tried to disclose our findings, and we ended up with these 4 CVEs and a vulnerability report by Oracle. So we were not able to fingerprint all the responsible vendors, and not all the websites responded to our disclosure messages. But the most prominent vulnerability we found is CVE, the top CVE in OpenSSL. And it's actually a quite interesting CVE because obviously we scanned OpenSSL beforehand in our lab setting, but the vulnerability did not pop up. So we were completely unaware that OpenSSL is actually vulnerable. And the reason for this is that this vulnerability only shows if you use the OpenSSL API in an unintended way. And the S-server application, which is shipped with OpenSSL to test OpenSSL, is actually not using the OpenSSL API in an unintended way, and therefore does not show this vulnerability. So you can find the current process of our disclosure process on GitHub. It's available under this URL, and there's also some additional information about padding oracle vulnerabilities. And if you want, you can also download our tool, TLS Scanner, with which you can scan individual servers for padding oracle vulnerabilities. It also tries to identify vulnerabilities, so you can actually see which vulnerability you have found. And maybe you can also help us to identify other vendors which are also affected. So with that, I come to the contributions and conclusions. So we found 93 different vulnerabilities, and we responsibly disclosed our findings so that actually a little over 90% of our vulnerabilities are now fixed in the implementations. And we released open source tools with which vendors and developers and administrators can actually scan their servers to find out if they are vulnerable to these attacks. And our paper showed that these large-scale scans can actually help to uncover new vulnerabilities which did not show up in a lab setting. So this is the technique which can actually be used to find new vulnerabilities. And it also showed that implementing CBC in a MAC-PAD-WAN encrypt scheme is pretty damn hard, because we did not check for this constant time implementation. We did not check for other side channels. All our findings are very obvious if you look at the network traffic. So I expect that there are way more vulnerabilities. And maybe it is time to remove CBC support entirely, because if nobody's using CBC, you cannot be vulnerable to these attacks. Thank you.
Hi, so you found vulnerabilities in like 2% of the Alexa top million. I'm wondering, like, where were they distributed amongst the top million? Did you see like were some in like the top 100 or like that?
Yeah, we also have vulnerable servers in the top 10. Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
How confident are you that you found all of these, in the sense that you reduced your test vector set? Yeah. How confident are you that you didn't make some mistakes when you reduced that?
Oh, that's a great question. That's also a question one of the reviewers had. And the thing is, we scanned 50,000 servers, and if you can do some clever statistics, and then you can calculate how many servers we might have missed, and it's actually quite low, but you could design your vectors differently. So you can choose a different size, you can choose different malformities, and suddenly you will find additional vulnerable servers. So there are probably way more. So we were very conservative with the estimation. So we excluded a lot of servers which responded non-deterministically, for example.
And do you think the 2% that you found, would that be higher on the longer tail, like the non-popular sites, so all the sites that are not on the top million?
Yeah. So the 50,000 servers we scanned, we had like 5% vulnerabilities, because they are probably more IoT devices and more diverse implementations. So in the Alexa list, you probably have the same vendors over and over again. So this is why probably there are even more vulnerabilities out there.
Yeah. Hey, Daniel Genkin, University of Michigan. You just mentioned that you ignored servers that responded non-deterministically.
Yeah.
Did you try looking at the distributions and seeing if if the distributions are different based on if you if you send an invalid message or not?
It's
harder, I know.
We did this after the paper, so you can do this, and then you can find even more vulnerabilities. But we did think that this is not so convincing for a research paper. So,
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, another round of applause. Thank you.